Found this when I was going through some old photo albums, his dad had texted. What the heck? That gut tightness eased up, some, when Egan saw it was a slightly off-center image taken in front of the main barn on the ranch. His dad had obviously used his phone to take a picture of the old photo. Emphasis on old. It was a shot that his grandmother, Effie, had snapped 30 years ago on Egan's 8th birthday. His brother, Cal, would have been 6. His sister, Remy, a 2-year-old toddler, and his other brother, Blue, was just 4. Stair-steps, people called them, since they'd all been born just 2 years apart. In the photo, his dad, looking lean, fit, and young, was in the center, flanked by Egan and Remy on the right, and Cal and Blue on the left. Remy and Blue were both grinning big, toothy grins. Cal and Egan weren't. Probably because they'd been old enough to understand that life as they'd known it was over. Their lives hadn't exactly gone to hell in a handbasket, but this particular shot had been taken only a couple of weeks after their mother had died from cancer. A long, agonizing death that had left their dad the widower of 4 young kids. Still, his dad was eking out a smile in the picture, and he'd managed to gather all 4 of them in his outstretched arms. Bittersweet times. That's when their mom's mom, Grammy Effie, had come to Saddlebrook for what was supposed to have been a couple of months, until his dad got his footing. Effie was still living on the ranch 30 years later and had obviously put down roots as deep as his father's. Egan was wondering what had prompted his dad to go digging through old family albums when his phone dinged again. It was another text from his dad, another photo. It was an image that Egan also knew well, and he mentally referred to it as the start of phase 2 of his life. The first phase had been with a loving mother that sadly he now couldn't even remember. That had ended with her death. Phase 2 had begun when his dad had gotten remarried 4 years later to a young, fresh-faced Captain Audrey Granger, who'd then been stationed at the very base in San Antonio where Egan was now. It was an hour's commute to the ranch that Audrey had diligently made. For a while, anyway. In this shot, his dad and new bride dressed in blue were in the center, and both were flashing giddy smiles. Ditto for Remy and Blue. Again, no smiles for Cal and Egan, since they'd been 10 and 12 respectively, and were no doubt holding back on the glee to see how life with their stepmom would all play out. It hadn't played out especially well. But then it also hadn't hit anywhere near the hell in a handbasket mark either. If there'd been a family photo taken just 2 years later, though, Audrey probably wouldn't have been in it. By then, she'd been in Germany, or maybe England. Instead of an hour commute, she'd come home to the ranch a couple of times a year. Then, as her career had blossomed, the visits had gotten further and further apart. These days, Brigadier General Audrey Donnelly only came home on Christmas, if that. Egan sent his dad a thumbs-up emoji to let him know he'd seen the pictures, and he was considering an actual reply to ask if all was well, but his alarm went off. He got up, mentally going through his schedule for the day. As the commander of the fighter training squadron at Randolph AFB, Texas, there'd be the usual paperwork, going over some stats for the pilots in training, and then in the afternoon, he'd get to do one of the things he loved most. Fly. Of course, it would be under the guise of a training mission in the T-38C Talon jet, not the F-16 that Egan used to pilot, but it would still give him that hit of adrenaline. Still give him the reminder of why he'd first joined the Navy and then had transferred to the Air Force so he could continue to stay in the cockpit. Egan showered, put on his flight suit, read through his emails on his phone, and was about halfway through his first cup of coffee when his doorbell rang. He had the same reaction to it as he had the earlier text, a punch of dread that something was wrong. It wasn't even 7 o'clock yet, and hardly the time for visitors, especially since he lived in base housing and therefore wasn't on the traditional beaten path for friends or family to just drop by. Frowning,